The courtroom fell deathly silent, every gaze fixed on the tall, soft-spoken man standing at the podium. "Go back to Africa," Judge Caprio had said with a dismissive wave, a phrase meant to mock, maybe even provoke. But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly reached into his bag, withdrew a small brown leather folder, and opened it with surgical precision. What happened next stunned everyone. The courtroom's mood shifted as page after page of meticulously prepared legal arguments, citations, and evidence rolled out like a masterclass. Even the bailiff leaned forward, brows furrowed in disbelief. Judge Caprio's smirk slowly faded, and for the first time in a long time, he found himself speechless. What began as a petty fine became a courtroom reckoning no one saw coming. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss this moment in court. It began like any other routine morning at the Providence Municipal Court. The docket was long, the benches were filled with bleary-eyed residents clutching citations, and Judge Frank Caprio sat comfortably at the bench, sipping from a small paper cup of hot coffee. The courtroom buzzed with the low murmur of shuffling papers, whispered conversations, and the occasional thump of a file dropped by a clerk. Then, the clerk called the next case. Denzel Akande, speeding in a school zone. A moment later, a tall, lean man in a tailored navy peacoat rose from the back row and made his way to the front. He moved with the deliberate calm of someone used to being watched and misjudged. In his late 20s, maybe early 30s, Denzel had the kind of quiet presence that filled a space without force. His glasses were round and wire-rimmed, framing sharp, observant eyes. His posture was straight, his black shoes immaculately polished, and his every movement measured. Nothing about him was careless. The courtroom took note. Some in the gallery sat up straighter, curious. Others glanced down at their own traffic citations, suddenly aware that this young man didn't fit the usual mold of defendants passing through. As he stepped up to the podium, he greeted the judge with quiet confidence. "Good morning, Your Honor." His accent caught a few ears immediately. British, tinged with West African roots. It wasn't loud or boastful, but carried a certain elegance that made even the bailiff raise an eyebrow. It wasn't something you often heard in a traffic court in Providence. Judge Caprio adjusted his glasses, glancing down at the file in front of him. He looked at the name again, then up at the man standing before him. "Says here you were clocked doing 31 miles an hour in a 20-mile-per-hour school zone, Mr. Akande," Caprio said, his tone light and teasing. "Now, unless you were late to give a lecture on quantum physics, I'm guessing you have an explanation for me." The courtroom chuckled gently. Even Denzel allowed himself a small, polite smile, but he didn't offer any rebuttal. Caprio leaned forward. "You work around here?" he asked. Denzel nodded. "Yes, sir. I'm a legal intern with the Rhode Island Public Defender's Office." The courtroom reaction was subtle but noticeable. A few surprised looks, a murmur from one of the reporters in the back. Caprio's eyebrows went up. "A lawyer in training, huh?" he said with a grin. "Great. That means I'm about to be cross-examined for trying to enforce the speed limit." There was another wave of light laughter. The judge was warming up, as he often did, turning the courtroom into a place where tension gave way to humor, where humanity showed through the robe and gavel. That's why people tuned in, not just for justice, but for moments like these. Denzel stood calmly, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the podium. He didn't react like most people did. No fidgeting, no nervous shifting, no long-winded excuses about kids being late or unfamiliar roads. He simply waited, poised, as if he already knew where this was going, and was ready for it. Caprio studied him a bit longer. There was something intriguing about the way this young man held himself. Not arrogant, but prepared. Not defensive, but grounded. What law school? Caprio asked, curiosity now taking over. Brown University Law School, Denzel replied. Third-year student, sir. Well, Caprio said, sitting back, it's not every day I get a Brown law student in here trying to beat a speeding ticket. This should be interesting. The courtroom chuckled again, but behind the judge's smile was something more, an undercurrent of challenge, of testing. He had seen thousands of cases over his decades on the bench. He could spot the fakers, the bluffers, the people who memorized a few buzzwords from legal dramas and tried to throw them around like they meant something. But this one, Denzel, he was different. Caprio leaned forward once more, his voice still friendly, but now tinged with curiosity. Tell me, Mr. Akande, what are you hoping for here? A reduction? A dismissal? A lesson in traffic law? Denzel's voice was steady. I'm hoping for fairness, sir. I believe there are circumstances worth reviewing. Something about that answer made Caprio pause. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't arrogant. It was precise. And beneath that precision, something else stirred. Something that even the judge didn't recognize at first. Respect. Not for the court as a structure, but for the law itself. He glanced back down at the paperwork and tapped his pen on the desk. All right, counselor, he said finally, with a faint smirk. You've got the floor. What no one realized, not the court clerk, not the laughing audience, not even Judge Frank Caprio himself, was just how thoroughly Denzel Akande had prepared for this moment. He didn't come to court just to get a fine reduced. He came to court to hold it accountable. The courtroom thought they were about to hear a defense. What they were about to witness was a masterclass. Judge Caprio leaned back slightly in his chair, giving the impression of ease, but those who knew him well recognized that look. The slight narrowing of the eyes, the faint purse of the lips. It was the expression he wore when something piqued his interest. He tilted his head and addressed the young man in front of him with his trademark blend of charm and curiosity. All right, Mr. Akande, he said, folding his hands on the bench. What do you have to say for yourself? Denzel adjusted the lapels of his coat and reached into his messenger bag, pulling out a sleek leather folder. His movements were deliberate, smooth. He opened the folder and began arranging a few pages neatly atop the podium. I'd like to request a dismissal based on a procedural defect, Your Honor, he said calmly. A ripple of intrigue moved through the gallery. It was subtle, but you could feel it. The way heads turned slightly, the sudden stillness as people leaned forward. Even the stenographer's fingers paused momentarily before returning to the keys. Judge Caprio raised a single brow. A procedural defect? He echoed, bemused. Counselor, this isn't law and order. You're in traffic court, not the Supreme Court. Soft laughter spread through the courtroom, but Denzel didn't flinch. He didn't even smile. He waited for the room to settle before replying, his voice steady and respectful. Yes, Your Honor, but per Rhode Island General Laws, Title 31, Chapter 14, Section 2, enforcement of reduced speed limits in school zones must comply with clearly defined operational standards, specifically active flashing lights and unobstructed signage during school hours. He turned a page in his folder. I have submitted photographic evidence taken at precisely 8:07 a.m., the time listed on the citation. This photograph shows the intersection in question. As you'll see, the school zone flashing light was not operational. Additionally, the signage indicating the 20-mile-per-hour school zone was partially obscured by a tree branch. He handed a glossy 8x10 photo to the bailiff, who brought it up to the bench. Caprio adjusted his glasses and studied the image for a moment. You took this yourself? Yes, sir. The morning after the citation, same day of the week, same time window. The conditions were identical. Caprio leaned in a little more, his gaze fixed on the photograph. Sure enough, the school's own light, mounted high on a leaning metal post, showed no indication of activity, and the rectangular yellow sign, intended to warn drivers of the reduced limit, was half covered by a thick branch brimming with spring leaves. The judge gave a low whistle. "Well, he muttered. "Didn't expect that." Denzel continued, flipping to another page. "I've also included a printout of the school's daily schedule from their official website. According to their records, the building does not open to students until 8:30 a.m. on weekdays. Therefore, even if the signage had been fully visible and the lights operational, the school zone enforcement would not have been in effect at the time I was cited." He offered the paper to the bailiff, who once again passed it forward. Silence settled over the room. It wasn't the kind of silence born from boredom or delay. It was reverent, the kind that followed something surprising, something sharp. A couple of people in the gallery leaned toward each other and whispered quietly. One woman near the front mouthed, "Wow." Even the prosecutor, an older man with tired eyes and a coffee-stained tie, cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Caprio set down the paper slowly, folding his hands again. This time, he looked at Denzel with genuine respect. "You've done your homework," he said simply. "I believe due process includes proper notice," Denzel replied. "If the indicators that a school zone is active are not clearly visible or functioning, then the foundational elements of the violation are not met. That's not a technicality, it's the law." It wasn't arrogant, it wasn't grandstanding, it was simply correct. Caprio sat in silence for a moment, letting the words settle. He looked at the young man not just as a defendant anymore, but as a peer in a way, a budding mind of the law. "You know," Caprio said finally, voice thoughtful, "when I started this job, I thought most of what I'd be doing was telling people to slow down and show up on time. And then someone like you walks in, calm, prepared, respectful, and reminds me why the law matters." He glanced toward the prosecutor. "Do you wish to contest the motion?" The prosecutor sighed and shook his head. "No, Your Honor," he muttered. "I concede." Caprio turned back to Denzel. There was a pause, a beat, and then, "Case dismissed." A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom again, but this time there was applause. A few people actually clapped, quickly, awkwardly, but it happened. Denzel didn't turn or acknowledge it. He simply nodded toward the judge. "Thank you, Your Honor." Caprio smiled, that wise twinkle now back in his eye. "Don't thank me. Thank that camera and tree branch. And maybe, just maybe, thank that sharp legal mind of yours." He leaned back again. "But don't get too cocky. I'm still the one with the gavel." Laughter rang out across the courtroom, this time genuine and warm. No one had expected much from a simple school zone case that morning. But by the time Denzel stepped away from the podium, more than one person realized they had just witnessed something rare. A courtroom lesson, not in punishment, but in preparation, poise, and principle. 15 to 20. Emotional twist. Caprio cleared his throat. "Where are you from originally, Mr. Akande?" "I was born in Lagos, Nigeria. I immigrated to the UK when I was 10. Came to the US on a scholarship for law." Caprio nodded slowly. "And you're telling me you got a better grasp of Rhode Island traffic code than some of the officers writing these tickets?" "I read every case I can, sir. I have to," Denzel said, his voice steady. "When you grow up watching your community be treated like they don't understand the law, you either stay quiet or learn it better than they do." Caprio stared at him. "You've been stopped like this before, haven't you?" "Yes, Your Honor. 8 times, always for looking out of place. But the law isn't a place. It's a tool, and anyone can learn to use it." Judge Caprio remained seated, his posture shifting ever so slightly as the courtroom settled again. He didn't speak for several seconds. Instead, he tapped his pen slowly against the wood of his bench, the soft rhythm cutting through the expectant silence like a metronome of thought. His eyes lingered on Denzel, not critically, not even analytically, but with something softer, something contemplative. "You know, Mr. Akande," he began, his voice low, measured, "I've been sitting on this bench longer than many of the people in this courtroom have been alive. I've seen every excuse imaginable, every sob story, every version of 'it wasn't me' that exists." A pause. "But I don't think I've ever seen someone walk in here with your level of preparedness, your calm, your clarity." The judge glanced toward the gallery, his gaze drifting slowly across the seated spectators, the young mother with her toddler, the elderly man with a cane, the group of interns from a local university watching for academic credit. Then his gaze returned, squarely and unmistakably, to Denzel. "When I made that comment earlier, 'Go back to Africa.'" He stopped. The courtroom was still. The words hung in the air, sharp and unblinking. Caprio exhaled and set down his pen. "I said it thinking I was being clever, thinking I was mocking some fresh-faced intern who probably thought he knew better than me. I thought you were a show-off, that you were here to make a point, not to seek justice." The words came slowly now, like they had weight. "And I was wrong." Caprio leaned forward slightly, his eyes now not just observing, but seeing. Really seeing. "It was inappropriate," he continued. "And more than that, it was careless. In this courtroom, words matter. The law is made of words. And when I said that to you, even as a joke, I forgot that those words have a history tied to pain, dismissal, exclusion." Denzel stood perfectly still. He didn't respond, didn't flinch. But the shift in the air was visible. His eyes glistened faintly, not tears, but something deeper, a quiet resilience laced with decades of inherited silence. He didn't need to speak. His silence was the statement. Caprio drew in a breath and nodded slowly to himself. "You're not just another slick talker. You're not here to dazzle me with legalese. You're someone who studied this system, not because it was handed to you, but because, I suspect, it once held you back, maybe even hurt you." He gestured slightly, palms upward in an almost supplicating motion. "And instead of turning away, you decided to understand it, master it, use it, not for vengeance, but to protect, to make it better." The gallery remained quiet. The mood had shifted entirely from procedural to personal. This wasn't traffic court anymore. It was a reckoning, a rare and raw moment of self-examination from a judge the community had come to admire for his fairness, now laying himself bare in front of that very community. Caprio leaned back in his chair again, though this time he didn't look quite as relaxed. He looked humbled. "I've always said this courtroom is more than citations and fines," he murmured. "It's a place for people, real people, and sometimes we need reminding of what justice is supposed to look like, not just punishment, not even forgiveness, but understanding." He paused, then looked at Denzel once more, this time with a different kind of focus. "I'm not just going to dismiss your citation, Mr. Akande. That much is already done." He tapped his index finger on the edge of the bench. "I want you to come back here." The room stirred. A couple of heads lifted. A few murmurs flitted across the courtroom. "Come back here," Caprio repeated, "and sit with me on the bench, for a day, maybe longer. Observe the people, the struggles, the choices we make here. I want you to see how the other side of justice works, really works, because if there's one thing I'm sure of now, it's that this system needs more people like you, people who carry both the law and compassion in equal measure." A collective gasp rippled across the courtroom, genuine astonishment at what they were witnessing. This wasn't protocol. It wasn't routine. This was history, unfolding in real time. Denzel blinked once, then again. His throat moved slightly as he swallowed, trying to find his voice without letting it waver. His hand instinctively rested on the folder in front of him, as if grounding himself. "I would be honored," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Caprio gave a small, knowing nod. "I thought you might be." He smiled then, softly, almost like a father might, after watching his child pass their first real test, not with bravado, but with quiet strength. He looked to the gallery again. "Let this day serve as a reminder," he said, raising his voice just enough for all to hear, "that our courts are not machines. They are mirrors, and every so often, someone walks in who forces us to take a good hard look at our own reflection." With that, he gently struck his gavel once. Next case. Just as Judge Caprio began reaching for the gavel to finalize his decision, a sudden sound cut through the quiet courtroom. A throat clearing, firm, deliberate. It came from the back of the chamber, where a uniformed Providence police officer slowly stood, cap tucked under one arm, posture stiff with purpose. "Your Honor," the officer said respectfully. "If I may?" Caprio paused mid-motion and looked up, one brow raised. He squinted slightly, adjusting his glasses, then nodded. "Go ahead, officer." The man stepped forward, each step echoing against the floor. His nameplate read, T. McGinnis, and though his face bore the calm neutrality of law enforcement, there was a flicker of something else in his expression. Concern, maybe even guilt. "I'm the officer who issued the citation to Mr. Akande that morning." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a department-issued tablet, its screen glowing faintly as he tapped to pull up a digital report. He hesitated briefly, then turned the screen to the judge. "There's something that needs to be acknowledged on the record," he said slowly. "Mr. Akande mentioned a discrepancy with the camera's timestamp and school hours earlier. At first, I dismissed it, but after rechecking our logs, he's correct." The room tensed, curious. Caprio leaned forward, his expression shifting from curiosity to intent. "Explain." McGinnis nodded. "Our speed enforcement cameras in school zones are supposed to sync with a central server. That server updates the system's internal clock every morning, ensuring citations only trigger when the school zone is actually in effect. But that morning, the sync system was undergoing scheduled maintenance. IT logged it, but the field units weren't notified to suspend citations temporarily." He glanced at Denzel. "So while the lights weren't flashing and the sign was obscured, the camera still flagged anyone going over 20 miles per hour as if the zone was active. That's on us. We should have paused enforcement until the sync was restored." Caprio looked slowly from the officer to Denzel, who stood still and respectful, never smug, never vindicated aloud. He didn't need to say, "I told you so." The evidence said it for him. "So, even the system," Caprio said, his voice steady, "admits it was wrong." McGinnis gave a single solemn nod. "Yes, sir." A hush fell over the courtroom. Some spectators exchanged glances. Others simply watched, fascinated, as the rare scene unfolded, an officer of the law voluntarily admitting a mistake. A judge reckoning not just with the defendant's argument, but with the fault lines of the system itself. Caprio turned his gaze back to Denzel, who stood not as a triumphant victor, but as someone still shouldering the gravity of the moment. There was no gloating, only quiet composure. The judge leaned back again, his eyes cast slightly upward, as though weighing the air. "You know what this reminds me of?" he said, more to the courtroom than anyone in particular. "It reminds me that justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's also about admitting when the system gets it wrong, and learning from it. He paused. Mr. Akande didn't just walk in here to defend himself. He walked in here and taught us something. He tapped his gavel gently, not in finality, but for emphasis. This is more than a defense, he said. This is an education. The words rang out, subtle but heavy with meaning. Caprio turned once more to the officer. Thank you, Officer McGinnis. It takes integrity to own a mistake like that, especially in public. McGinnis gave a respectful nod and returned to his seat, the quiet murmurs of the courtroom trailing behind him. Then the judge looked again to Denzel, something in his expression softening. I have no doubt, Mr. Akande, that one day you'll be standing behind a bench of your own. And I hope when you do, you remember this day, not for the win, but for the reminder it offered all of us. He paused. You don't change the world with grand speeches. You do it with truth, with details, with evidence, with patience, and sometimes with uncomfortable honesty. Denzel gave a small nod. I'll remember, sir. Caprio smiled, that familiar glint returning to his eyes, warmth restored, ego humbled, wisdom shared. You'd better, he said with a wink, because if I ever end up in your courtroom one day, I expect you to be just as tough on me. Laughter rippled across the room again, softer this time, full of relief and admiration. Denzel allowed himself a smile. For a moment, the weight he carried seemed lighter, and in that courtroom, on that day, justice wasn't just something delivered, it was something shared. Judge Caprio sat in reflective silence, his fingers gently drumming the edge of the bench as the final words from the officer still echoed faintly in the room. Then, with a measured breath, he slowly closed the manila case file in front of him, the soft thud resonating like a gavel in slow motion. He looked up at Denzel. Mr. Akande, he began, his voice quieter now, almost reverent, I'm dismissing this case, with prejudice. A ripple of murmurs moved through the room, subtle, respectful. But Judge Caprio didn't stop there. He leaned back, removed his glasses, and gave the young man in the peacoat a long, thoughtful look. But I'm doing more than that. He turned his attention to the court clerk seated beside him, voice now firm. I want this transcript sent to the Rhode Island Bar Association. All of it. The procedural defense, the evidence, the officer's admission, and this resolution. He gestured toward Denzel. This young man is still in law school, Caprio said, but he just ran circles around our process with professionalism, precision, dignity, and frankly, grace. Denzel didn't move. His hands rested on the podium, fingers interlaced, but the faintest flicker passed across his face, humility edged with the quiet acknowledgement of hard-won respect. Judge Caprio's gaze didn't waver. I've seen people walk into this courtroom angry, broken, desperate. I've seen them try to argue their way out of a ticket with excuses, with lies, with bravado. But every now and then, someone walks in here not just to win a case, but to remind us why this whole system exists in the first place. He paused, turning once more to address the courtroom. You all saw it. Every word he said, every document he submitted, it wasn't just about him. It was about the principle, about fairness, about due process. That's not something you can teach easily in law school. Caprio looked back to Denzel. That comes from experience, from pain, from love for something bigger than yourself. Denzel's throat moved slightly, a quiet swallow. His eyes never left the judge. Caprio leaned forward, voice softening with admiration. Mr. Akande, when I retire, people like you will make sure this bench still means something. And for that, I thank you. A beat of silence. Then it happened. One person in the back row clapped, tentative, unsure. Another followed, then more. The courtroom, often silent and procedural, transformed in a matter of seconds into a scene of heartfelt applause. Dozens of hands came together, not for the case being dismissed, but for what it symbolized: respect, redemption, integrity. Denzel didn't bask in it. He gave only a small nod of acknowledgement, eyes lowered for a moment, almost as though holding back something deeper than pride. Judge Caprio smiled, letting the applause settle. When it quieted, he spoke once more, this time with the warmth of a mentor. "I've sat on this bench for a long time, Mr. Akande, long enough to know when someone is just performing and when someone is standing in their purpose." He reached for a sheet of paper and began scribbling something on it with his pen. "Here," he said, tearing it off and handing it to the clerk. "This is my personal number. Give it to Mr. Akande and tell him I want to take him to lunch sometime." The courtroom chuckled gently, touched by the moment. Caprio turned back to Denzel. "Because the next time you're sitting behind a bench like this, and someone looks at you the way I looked at you today, I want you to remember how it felt to be seen, and then do the same for someone else." Denzel finally spoke, his voice steady but thick with meaning. "I will, sir." Judge Caprio smiled. "I believe you." He tapped the gavel once, softly. "Case dismissed. And Mr. Akande, thank you." A final wave of applause followed, not thunderous, but heartfelt, like a standing ovation in spirit. Some people even stood, instinctively moved by something rare: truth winning in a place people often associate with punishment. As Denzel gathered his folder and turned to leave, he passed by Officer McGinnis, who nodded at him with quiet respect. Outside the courtroom, the sky had turned brighter, morning fog giving way to sunlight, and though the ticket was gone, what lingered was something much larger than a piece of paper. A young man had walked into a courtroom accused. He walked out affirmed. And somewhere deep in the foundation of that old Providence courthouse, justice didn't just echo. It breathed in a courtroom built to deliver justice. A routine speeding ticket unraveled into something far more profound. One man, armed not with rage, but with preparation and poise, stood his ground in a system that too often assumes guilt over innocence and silence over speech. Judge Caprio didn't just dismiss a charge, he learned from the person standing before him. That day, the courtroom wasn't about crime and punishment, it was about understanding, growth, and the kind of change that begins when someone dares to speak the truth, clearly, respectfully, and unshakably. Denzel Akande walked out of that courtroom with his record clean, his head high, and his future brighter than ever. And for everyone watching, he left behind a powerful reminder: knowledge is power, but character? That's the legacy. What did you think of Denzel's courage and courtroom brilliance? Have you ever felt unheard, yet stood your ground with the truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know where you're watching from and how this story impacted you. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a moment in the courtroom where justice meets humanity. And as Judge Caprio would say, we're all in this together, so let's make it better, one case at a time.